Good morning. Welcome. We might make a start. So welcome to the first seminar for the Animal Welfare Science Centre seminar series in 2025. It's fantastic to see so many people here in person and online. And as you can see, it's quite fitting, I think, as we are now here in 2025, to think about the last 25 years of animal welfare science, to really reflect on what has been and start to think about where we can go. So what is possible? And I hope you will agree that we've got three fantastic speakers with us today that are going to consider that. I'd like to just quickly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong's people, and we pay our respect to their leaders past, present and emerging. Wouldn't be right if I didn't have a few technologies. Really, as I mentioned, really pleased to have you all with us. And I thought I would pop up this quick map to show not only have we got people joining us in person, but we've also got people joining us online, and they're joining us from all around the world. So a really big welcome to everyone, and we look forward to having you join us. What we thought we might start with is a couple of questions though, because it's always good to get to know our audience a little bit. So we've got, oops, if Poll Everywhere wants to behave for me. We've got the Poll Everywhere here. So if you can use your phones to scan the QR code, it is a little bit small, so you may need to zoom in, but if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and just to let us know, here we are. So where you are from. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So quite a range of people joining us from different organisations and different groups, which is fantastic. I can't be trusted with anything. It's technology.
And our camera is just covering up the code in case anyone needs.
There we can start to see. Interesting. Yep. And reasons for coming. So nice to see some new scientific knowledge, which is excellent. Industry innovation starting to come through there as well. We've also got building networks, fantastic. So a wide range of reasons, and it's really great to see people coming for these different reasons. So hopefully you can start to get quite a bit out of these seminars, because I know we at the centre certainly do. I might let you get me back to it. Excellent. All right, well, it's probably enough of me and my technology challenges. We might get straight into it, why we're all here. And it's with great pleasure that I get to invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Sally Sherwen, who is Director of Wildlife Conservation and Science at Zoos Victoria. And I think it's really quite fitting that Sally is going to speak to us today around animal welfare research within, because her PhD research was really the first robust work that looked at welfare within zoos. And so she's really well placed to talk to what we've seen over the last 25 years and perhaps where we're aiming to get moving forward. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sally Sherwen.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to be any better at the tech here. I might just, can I flick with the slides? Yeah, perfect. I'll stick to that. Thanks, Lauren. It's great to be back. I've missed this place, the AWSC. Yeah, had lots of incredible work here, and love being back with all of the brilliant people that dedicate so much of their lives and careers to improving animal welfare. And a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today was really initiated from this collaboration with the AWSC and continues to thrive with that partnership as well. So very grateful for that work. I'd also like to start by acknowledging Wurundjeri country and pay respects to elders past and present, but also acknowledge the work that the zoos do across 4 properties across Yorta Yorta country, Wadawurrung, Bunurong and Wurundjeri country. But also all of our conservation work that happens across all different mobs across Victoria, and working in partnership, which is incredibly rewarding and has shaped our conservation work in particular. So I'll get straight into it. I thought what we'll cover today, a bit of a summary of zoos in the industry, a bit of a snapshot of moments I think that have shaped the industry relevant to zoos, some ethical concerns with zoos, and then work to unpack a few of those. So a bit of a blend between ethics and science, and then I thought I'd use Zoos Victoria as a bit of an example of how I think zoos should really take these ethical concerns really seriously and drive practice changes to respond to that. So I'll draw on Zoos Vic as an example, but it's not stuff that's happening exclusively at Zoos Vic. It does happen at other zoos as well, although not as much as I would have hoped, but we're trying to help shape all zoos' progress globally. And then I'll finish with some challenges and areas I think that we really need to drive more progress in for the future. So hopefully that sounds all right. Speed me up if I'm boring you. So zoos, we think 10,000 zoos worldwide. So there's estimates of how many people go through zoo gates. It's up around 700, 800 million or something like that. The estimates are real loose because not all zoos are accredited or have gone through formal regulation processes. So there's a lot of what we call roadside zoos that operate and other situations. So huge diversity of species housed in these facilities. And I think a lot of these characteristics make the animal welfare and ethics space quite unique in addressing a lot of these for zoos. So it's important for us to acknowledge them and just have in our mind as we talk more about this. So diversity of species, different layers of human interaction. So from the visitor's point of view, so unfamiliar humans, a lot of interaction obviously with zookeepers and the caretakers. There's vets as well, often in a lot of zoos, and volunteers. And so a huge range of people that these animals are exposed to on a regular basis. And I think also what is, I think getting a lot of attention more recently is the reason for having animals in captivity in zoos. So the ethical justification has changed. So going from a predominantly entertainment-based sector to really now focusing on conservation. And so that changes how I think people conceptualize and work and drive changes in practice. So I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff because this crowd is very familiar with a lot of these animal welfare big events or milestones that have happened historically. The ones more, I think, relevant to zoos, David Mellor's 5 Domains has been really widely adopted in the zoo industry. I'm not sure if it has been as widely adopted in other animal industries, but the zoos love it. It's written into the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums animal welfare strategies. A lot of zoo accreditation systems, refer to it and use it. I would say not always as David intended, and Paul and I were talking about the recent paper from Jordan and Lauren and others that were on that paper. So it does have a bit of a risk of being misused in how it's applied, but overall it's been a really positive, I think, drive towards making people think more about animal welfare. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in 2012, I think, has driven a lot of probably more from the public reflection point of view about what animals are capable of experiencing. And then I think really challenging, is it right to have that species in zoos and experiencing what they can? So great apes in particular. And linked to that, then a lot of documentaries that came out in the public space that got a lot of traction. So Blackfish, the one that exposed a lot of the challenges with orcas at SeaWorld, had a huge impact on the aquarium industry. And that's led to a lot of legislation change in Canada and other parts of the world, preventing the breeding of orcas in captivity and phasing them out ultimately. So big movements that happened as a result of these documentaries. Also lawsuits around habeas corpus, so the right to freedom and human rights being ascribed to animals, again linked, I think, to this Declaration on Consciousness. So big questions for zoos to grapple with in this space. Then for us here at Zoos Victoria, another really pivotal moment for us was the bushfires. And it seems a bit weird for a zoo, but for us that were working as Zoos Victoria, zoo-based conservation, working in the field in conservation work, but also our veterinary hospitals that see a lot of wildlife, really amped up our wildlife welfare response and was really the start of a new chapter in growing more into this space, trying to improve the welfare of animals in the wild through our zoos. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it was a big moment that I think changed community perceptions of some of these big environmental threats like climate change and brought an animal welfare lens to some of those environmental challenges. So an interesting time. Then, of course, COVID, it completely disrupted social norms. I think it helped a lot of us question our relationship with animals, whether it be our pets that were, trapped with us almost 24/7, and but also, it dramatically increased bird watching and connection to nature and things like that out in the wild as well. So that urban nature connection became really important, which is, again, I'll talk about an important part of the zoo world in how we operate. So this picture, to be honest, summarizes all three of these ethical concerns pretty nicely, I think. But there's a lot more ethical concerns with zoos and aquariums and the industry than these three. But I think fundamentally the big challenging ones are these that we can really focus in on. So the concept of keeping wild animals in captivity, can we ever really meet the needs of some of these really complex species? There's a lot of questioning that happens around, are we exploiting animals for human entertainment, or are they genuinely here for great conservation outcomes and what the role is here? So we'll unpack a few of these and understand what we know about each of them, and then talk about how Zoos Vic responds to some of these as part of, an ongoing piece of work. And also just wanted to note that these concerns really change and shape as we start to question our human relationship with animals and wildlife more generally. I know people like David Fraser can talk much more eloquently about this around, how human attitudes towards animals really changes. So from a kind of colonial mindset, compared to a potential like a First Nations mindset that considers animals as kin. So it's really a really interesting space to explore and challenge us. So starting off with wild animals in captivity, can their needs be met? Here's the answer. There's a lot behind it, but it really does depend on the species. But the other big, I think, unpacking some of the literature in this space as well that has happened. Georgia Mason has done a lot of work on this, as have other researchers, really understanding what is driving a lot of the abnormal repetitive behaviours that can be seen in some species. I find this paper was really interesting in terms of what the type of expression of abnormal repetitive behaviour, and then potentially giving clues as to what behaviour is being thwarted or frustrated. And so we do see this in a lot of zoo animals as well. So the oral stereotypies from animals like giraffes, that browsing is a really critical part of their repertoire, versus the more locomotive stereotypy like pacing, that it's likely more important for those animals that have large home range sizes that are needing to be moving and marking their territory and constantly seeking and exploring. So then Georgia and some of her students then continued some work on phylogenetic comparative methods that really tried to look at, can we predict what species might perform good or bad in captivity based on certain behavioural life history traits. And so they did big analyses across a whole bunch of different taxonomic groups and looked for any trends or predictive trends. And so the zoos really could be using this. It's early days in this space a lot, but zoos can use this kind of information to then inform likelihood of performance in captivity. So what species are we confident can live a good life in zoos? But also for us to know what type of behavioural programs would support better welfare outcomes for those animals. So some early results from this work around risk factors that do predict poor performance in captivity. I wouldn't say none of these are surprising. I feel like, a lot of the time we'd get a gut feeling that these kind of things are going to be important to big predators. So large home range sizes, the hunting strategy of predators that involved a long chase, large social group in the wild, obviously, assuming that that requires a heap of space to have a big group of animals housed in one place, and a complex foraging niche as well. So the ability, rather than, I think, being fed a bowl of food in captivity and having nutritional needs met, recognizing actually what goes into the foraging process and the welfare outcomes associated with that. So really, really interesting stuff to help inform some of these questions around what species should we have in zoos. But I do also want to acknowledge that we've got significant knowledge gaps in the space. And these figures, I think, highlight a lot of that as well. So this one highlights the number. So the number of different species in each of these taxonomic groups. So they're the little black dots. So you can see there's a high number of birds and fish that are housed in zoos and aquariums, much fewer species of amphibians and reptiles. And then the ones with the red line are the number of papers that have studied that taxonomic group. So you can see a really disproportionate focus on studying mammals in zoos compared to the number of species that exist in that group. A really non-balanced focus on fish in particular. Promising area is birds. So there seems to be an increasing focus on birds that's starting to potentially catch up with the number of species. To me, this just shows, where research is being directed in the groups and how much work we've got to do to understand what are reptiles, amphibians, and fish really experiencing in zoos and aquariums. So a challenge out there for any budding welfare science, really honing in on some of those groups. Then in terms of what is studied in the science to inform a lot of this work, this paper summarize the number of the proportion of publications in these different areas. So you can see a lot of focus historically has been on enrichment. So studying the impact of a certain enrichment device, or enrichment versus no enrichment, or enclosure design and social influences. Visitor and activity presence, I'd say a big proportion of that bar has come out of this group here, the Animal Welfare Science Centre, who's managed to, really do a lot of leading innovative work in that space. And we've got like Sam here of Sina Bell, who have contributed a lot to some incredible work in advancing the understanding in these space. But you can see as well, really scratching the surface of the zoo environment and all of the features that will impact animal welfare. So a huge amount of work to be done. So then the next logical question is, well, how do we start addressing that knowledge gap, and where and how do we start? The good news is it's increasing. So zoo research is on the rise and a bit of a booming field. A lot more zoos now are starting to invest in in-house zoo researchers and do more partnerships with uni. So it is a growing area. But still, it's tricky to know in that position, where on earth do you start? There are so many questions. And just something that we find particularly useful is really understanding the different levels and then prioritizing, using a tool to help prioritize your research effort. And so we do a risk assessment across all animals at Zoos Victoria that then gives us clues into how their welfare is tracking, a risk-based approach, what we think is going on. And that's drawn on from keeper knowledge and vet knowledge that we do once every couple of years, and collect that data and summarize it, and then go, wow, we've got a lot of knowledge gaps in this particular group of animals that we want to interrogate further, and then direct the research efforts and attention into that for the next year or so. We can also then analyze trends across particular areas of focus like sensory environment or human-animal interactions, and then invest research effort in a theme as well once we've got a risk process that helps us prioritize it. But overall, welfare science programs typically, a focus on the theoretical end, but much more. So they start often at the theoretical end. They're the ones that get a lot more multi-zoo studies and attention, and I think academic partnerships. But a lot of zoos are also doing really specific, not always published, but really specific research on, even a single animal or a particular one area of enclosure to really unpack what's going on there, which is good. And more of that research should be encouraged, but important to also link back to having it able to be peer reviewed and published so it can be shared and disseminated to drive improvements. But again, just reiterating, it really is a booming field and a lot of publications coming out. A lot of research still needs to happen to really answer a lot of these questions. So great area to be a part of. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of money in it. That's the big gap. But, there's not a lot of money in research in general. But anyway, unless you're a medical researcher, I think. But anyway, so a lot of the research that happens in the welfare space is really behaviour focused. So a really keen focus on that and using different tools to understand and analyse frequency of different behaviours that we think are important for these species. There's also a bit happening in stress physiology, not a huge amount, but a bit happening in terms of, and Meredith's here, who works with Kerry Fanson and the lab at La Trobe Uni that we partner with in endocrinology type, so non-invasive sampling of glucocorticoids, so particularly in fecal samples, but also doing some really exciting stuff on potentially like frog skin swabs as well to look for stress hormones, which is exciting. And then also a lot happening in the preference testing space. So trying to understand what animal preferences are. And here's an example of a research project that came again out of this group, Mark Lemuth, one of Paul's previous students, who did some neat preference testing studies on tortoises to see if they preferred different types of enrichment, so including a shell scratch from a hand, hibiscus flowers or other tortoise companies, and then analysed how they go in drawing inspiration from some of Lauren's May's work with pigs, applying that to tortoises. So really understanding individual preferences, which is neat. Another example of research is, through a lot of video cameras that are out and about across the zoo and analysing sleeping behaviour as well as daytime behaviour and social interactions. So I mostly just put this up because I think elephants look adorable when they're snoozing together in big like snuggle pods, but it is actually a really important input into us understanding their behavioural preferences and social relationships. So this sleep work has informed a big part of the research program that the team here are leading at the moment in understanding the welfare changes of the herd as they've moved from Melbourne Zoo to Werribee Open Range Zoo, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So then the other ethical challenge is that I've kind of wrapped up the last two into one, is this concept of why are wild animals kept in captivity? What's the reason for housing these animals? And this is really controversial because a lot of zoos genuinely think if the animal welfare is good and the animals are thriving, then what's wrong with that? Do we need a reason to have them in captivity? But a lot of other zoos, like Zoos Victoria, do have a strong position on, yes, every animal should be there for a purpose and that contribute to some kind of greater good, as well as ensuring that the animal welfare standards can be met. So how do we measure a zoo's commitment to conservation and what they contribute? It's, ridiculously complicated. There's no easy answer to this. There are governing bodies like the American Zoo and Association that set targets for the minimum spend of a zoo's revenue on conservation, which is one way to do it. We don't do that, but it's interesting to look at. WAZA, so the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, what their work does is try to set goals for the industry and then help everyone move towards that goal. So a bit of an incremental improvement focus. So they're working at the moment on setting a new zoo-based conservation goal, which is interesting. Some other metrics that we use at Zoos Victoria is looking at the number of species that have been, their extinction has been prevented as a result of zoo intervention. Birds, there's actually quite a high proportion of birds that would be extinct if not for zoo intervention at the moment. So there's a fair bit of research that goes into that space. Then there's the whole people side of conservation for zoos to try and measure and track. And there's a lot more research that's happened in this space, but still evidence is pretty scarce. Really clear, direct evidence of conservation benefit after visiting a zoo. But here are some of the ones that we look at. We also have a metric around post-visit survey and intention to act for wildlife for visitors, and we try and increase that through targeting different messaging. But yeah, learning outcomes through school visits, a whole range of different metrics as well. This literature as well that is interesting to track is, I think, really, I mean, if zoos aren't inherently motivated to drive conservation outcomes, this is another reason why conservation is important for zoos to do, because it increases public support. And so this figure is from 10 years ago, and I can only imagine it would be more extreme right now. From the WAZA document that basically dramatically increases support for zoos if you actively work in conservation. So that justification of having animals in captivity, the public seem to care deeply about having a good reason for it. Then some other literature, again, that I think shows this change. Again, I mentioned earlier that the ethical justification for captivity has changed over time. So in 2004, about 16% of zoos mentioned conservation in their mission statement or comms work. And 10 years later, it was up to 80%. This doesn't mean they're actually doing conservation though. So just keep that in mind. And I should have warned everyone, I'm probably the most critical zoo person that it works in a zoo, but I think it's healthy as well. But so up to 80%. And I mean, that's a good start to basically acknowledge your commitment. Then actually understanding what that commitment is and how deep it is another question. But then there was other interesting research or concepts coming out of UK researchers at Chester Zoo that looked at, well, what is the impact zoos can have, and trying to understand this as a new way of shaping zoos' role. So incorporating other elements like economic contribution, tourism, jobs, species conservation directly, and education and training. And then some really interesting data analysis work that happened across whole bigger collections of zoos, zoo animals and species, and analyze that what predicts the most contribution to conservation, and some trends that came out of that in terms of strong attendance likely to be a zoo that contributes to in situ conservation, which you could assume that is likely due to revenue and having potentially, a good amount of money that can be contributed towards it. The other interesting social part of this is that there's research that really clearly that people want to choose an ethical or welfare-friendly option when given the information. And so this is really important for the zoo industry to note, because there can be a lot of resistance potentially to shy away from talking about animal welfare, because it can be seen as, you don't want to open that can of worms and get people to question it. But what we can see in the literature is that people actually like to learn about animal welfare and want to know about it and want to make ethical and welfare-friendly choices. So this study was really interesting, where they just tested theoretical preference to visit a site, either bear country or tiger territory, with that basic information on the left of the slide. And then they retested it when they gave them welfare information on this scale of how good it is for the bear's welfare and conservation outcomes versus the tiger, and then looked at how people changed that preference. And they did see a significant difference in changes towards the more welfare-friendly and conservation-friendly experience, which is good news. The other piece of research I think that's really important in this space to get zoos to take seriously and question and change practice is some recent evidence that has come out of the zoo world, both in Chicago, but also locally here through our incredible social science research team led by Emily McLeod, is that some really common zoo practices have been shown to actually undermine conservation goals. So it's really important for us to not just make assumptions about what we think people get out of a certain experience, but test it and then change your practice. So example of this is from Steve Russ's work in Chicago that looked at how presenting humans and animals together, or animals in anthropocentric type experiences and environments, changed versus natural environments, changed people's perception of whether they'd make a good pet, how endangered they were, and also their motivation to support its conservation. And so in summary, basically any images that showed an animal in close proximity to a human or in a human type environment, people were much more likely to think that that animal would make a good pet, that it wasn't endangered or in need of support. So the exact opposite that zoo messages that you want to be sending. And so we started digging into this a bit more, because we were noticing in our visitor encounters with animals that we were running, people were leaving them having a great time, loving the animal, but asking if they can get it as a pet. And we're going, what? That none of the comms in that, experience is about that. And so we looked at this research and they repeated this, I should say, a few years later on a whole bunch of other primates and found the exact same patterns. So Em and her student, Meg Shaw, repeated it to go, well, that's in America. You can have chimps as pets over there. What does our community think? We tested it. So Em and the team and Meg tested it on these different species here in our local community context, and lo and behold, found the exact same pattern as well. So it was really confronting for us to really grapple with, because we'd built this hypothesis that connecting people with animals through these experiences was driving conservation outcomes. We've been doing it for decades, really. And this was telling us, yes, people love the animal, but they love it in a not particularly healthy way. And the way we want them to love it is to respect it as a wild animal and to be motivated to support its conservation efforts in the wild. And so what we did then off the back of this is rewrote our guidelines around how we deliver these human-animal interactions. and move them from what we called a human-centric experience, which was all about what the animal gives you when you get your photo with it and blah, 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 to animal-centric experiences. So no photos of, no selfies. You can take photos of the animal, but not you with the animal. No hand feeding, hand touching, those kind of things, but focus much more. We didn't tell them what they can't do. It's much more focused on what you can do and how amazing the animal is. Still get to get close to the animal. And follow-up research that Emma's been doing really looks at what is desirable parts of these experiences. And it really is about the storytelling and the experience with the keeper learning about the animal, which is really positive. So a couple of years ago, no more than that, during COVID it was, we changed over all of our experiences and reevaluated and found much healthier conservation attitudes, still a really strong connection to these animals, and bonus, positive animal welfare outcomes and knowledge and appreciation of why choice and control and those features are important for animals. So we've since been working with a whole bunch of other zoos trying to spread this message. We've been working with tourism bodies and talking about, you know, the traps of or unintended consequences of how we present animals and talk about animals. And it is slowly resulting in industry change. So I don't know if you guys know, but Lone Pine announced that they were stopping, I think that was late last year, they were stopping koala cuddles and moving to a different model, which is great. Dreamworld have announced changes with their tiger interactions, and slowly things are starting to change as well. So we're hoping this is going to be a really positive next kind of the iteration for zoos. So let's unpack a little bit about how we can really listen to these ethical concerns that we're hearing and take them seriously, have the conversations, do science to understand what's going on and drive change in practice. So I'm going to use zoos as an example of how we're doing some of this work. I could stand here and talk to you about all of our conservation models and what we do, but this video summarizes it pretty nicely.
We often get asked what a zoo does in the 21st century. In fact, we think the word zoo doesn't fully explain what we're doing. So let's share with you what that is.
We run breeding and recovery programs for many local species on the brink of extinction.
We treat injured wildlife in our wildlife hospitals and send vets to run the triage centres in bushfire zones.
We're ready to respond to any marine animal needing our help.
We teach millions of visitors to care for the natural world and make wildlife-friendly choices.
Perhaps zoo isn't the right word at all.
Because we're actually a wildlife conservation organisation.
And for some species, we are their last hope.
We won't let Victoria's wildlife go extinct on our watch.
Little bit run the risk of little bit Zoos Vic promo, but I think it a little bit few cringy moments in there that anyway I'll do differently these days. But I think it just summarises the different streams of how we approach conservation and where we see our skill set contributing to the challenges. All of it, though, is underpinned by our Code of Animal Welfare and Ethics, which is really framed, again, with support from Bitter-Jones and the model that she developed around, is it justified, is it humane, and is it effective? So really being serious about our conservation reasoning behind activities. Humaneness is about understanding the welfare impact, or what is the most humane pathway or welfare-friendly pathway. And effective is about driving evidence-based decisions and really prioritising science and collecting data to inform it. So always a work in progress, but it has shaped a lot of changes in the last 10 years at Zoos Victoria. A big one for us in how we use it is about what we talked about, that first ethical concern around what species can live well in zoos, in particular in Melbourne zoos or Victorian zoos in our climate. And we have used it to make big changes to phasing out certain species, moving the elephants from Melbourne to Werribee, for example. And so, yeah, really pleased and proud that we are making changes. Of course, we still have a lifelong commitment to a lot of these animals. So we're not just going to ship them off to another zoo and have it someone else's problem. We'll, live out their life, but then no replacement of certain species. So tigers are an example of that. That we've agreed as a phase out for that species. We've tried a lot in being able to better meet their welfare needs, and have come to the conclusion, short of maybe a $100 million investment to give something a go, we just don't think we can give them the best life and the life that they need in captivity. But there's a whole bunch of other species as well that fit in that. So the species composition of zoos is going to be very different going forward. In particular, Melbourne Zoo is going to be a site where there's a lot of changes happening. Elephants is a big example of that unfolding right now. So the herd moved it from Melbourne footprint to Werribee, and the new elephant home at Werribee is the same size as the whole of Melbourne Zoo. And so you can imagine what the elephants are experiencing when they move there. I did have a longer video that makes everyone cry. Peter said she watched it and cried last night about the keeper's journey as well and preparing them. It's been about 10 years in the making. And yeah, finally here, it's welfare driven, and the whole design of the facility is welfare first. What do the elephants need? How do we best set up their lives in the environment? And then zoo stuff comes, zoo visitors and conservation messaging as well, then being laid onto that. So unfortunately, I subbed out the tearjerker video, but it's all over our socials if you want to have a look at it for a shorter video that just gives you a sense of the space that's been designed. So here's the herd, just the first day that they're allowed into this paddock, already exploring, and really, really incredible herd social dynamics. And I should say, Fee, Georgia, Sue and the team, Amy Rose and the keepers, have a really comprehensive animal welfare assessment program looking at short-term change and transition as well as longer term over 2 years, right? And yeah, really understanding the herd from, there's about, 10 different welfare indices that they're using to study how they're experiencing their new home. This is a great example of elephant first design. So they can walk over bridges. So previously at the Melbourne habitat, they were having to be locked in while visitors in a certain paddock, so visitors could move through, and then would stop the visitors and move the elephants. But this allows the elephants to freely explore wherever they want to go, and visitors go under them. So we're pretty proud of that. But again, the welfare data is going to be incredible to be able to understand. And what we really want to do with it is publish it, communicate it to other zoos, and set a new benchmark for how elephants should live in zoos. So not just about space. Obviously, we're lucky we've got this kind of space at Werribee, but the elephant-centered design. All right, talking a little bit more about conservation and the role of zoos. I'll be very brief in this section because I'll give you a high-level snapshot because it's complicated. A lot of ethical dilemmas riddled with every single species that we work with, especially this one. This is, and I won't go into detail because I'll get a bit preachy with it, I think. But this is the Victorian grassland earless dragon that was rediscovered in the Western grasslands just 18 months ago. So a conservation miracle, basically. The team were saying this is like the reptile version of the thylacine rediscovery. So thought to be extinct for 60 years and was rediscovered by chance at the last survey pre-development of a grassland in the west of Victoria. So huge ethical conflict between housing development and the need for people to have access to affordable housing and the last remaining population of a species. And so you couldn't get much more of an ethical dilemma than that one, but layer in a whole bunch of other political dynamics and social dynamics, and it's a movie in the making. But we're pleased to report from what we can control at Zoos Victoria, the team were incredible in predicting this or hoping that this day would come. personally, I was skeptical. I thought this poor lizard's gone. It's going to be our first extinction that we need to officially record on our focus list. But the team had been practicing breeding of a really closely related dragon, the Canberra grassland earless dragon. And so they were ready to go like that. So as soon as the animals were brought into the zoo, a portion of what was surveyed to be found at the rediscovery site, we're now up to, I think, 76. So we've got 2 populations of this species, over 100 animals that we thought were gone for forever. And so it's the most incredible conservation story. We just need to protect habitat, create more habitat, keep breeding, and get them back to the wild. But that's a great example of what we're seeing across so many species. This graph is grim. It shows species extinction trajectories going down for all taxonomic groups. All of our state of environment, federally and locally here at the state level, showed the same trend of species extinction trajectories not looking good. This is long-term data. We are confident we're turning things around for a few different species, but we can't really see that responding in this timescale at this moment. But the summary of the story is, yeah, the state of environment's bad and getting worse. And so what we need to do is really a bit of a call to arms and say, let's turn these things around. What I love is the creativity, especially of the Melbourne public. And so there are some awesome campaigns. Zoos Vic can't endorse these kind of campaigns, but they're creative people. I found this little caramello koala just in Abbotsford walking the streets, and I just thought that is amazing. Not the case for koalas in Victoria, I should say, but in the other states further up north. So people care, people are working on this, and there is hope. What we see our role in this space at Zoos Victoria is to show this hope and to show people, if we care, if we change pretty, moderate, minor behaviours, we can turn things around. So our skill set in conservation, because conservation is a team sport, right? We've got organisations, we all work together. There's land managers, there's habitat restoration experts, there's wetland experts. We bring a lot of species, tunnel vision focus on species. And these are our skill sets that we can contribute to the team, which is really in wildlife health and welfare through our incredible vet teams. Potential to influence people when they come through the gate. So we see almost 3 million visitors a year, hopefully more in the coming years. And we have a membership of 350,000. So a huge access to a really engaged audience. And we've honed breeding and animal care and translocation skills over 165 plus years of running zoos. Now we're using those skills for good to breed the right kind of animals here. But really keen, really important for us to notice. So we have these signs all through the corporate office that we are focused on. Our conservation work is focusing on animals in the wild. We don't call job done when an animal's secure in captivity. We call it job done when it's secure in captivity and contributing to healthy wild populations. And that's really important for us to know, because we've got to work towards the wild outcome, because it's easy, we find it easy these days to secure a genetically robust population and breed them up in captivity, but we don't accept a life of, which is the current state for bawbaw frogs, for example, of living a life in a frog bunker at Melbourne Zoo instead of in the wild. So we do that as a means to an end to get them back to the wild. And unfortunately, for a lot of the species we work with, there are more animals in our zoos than are left in the wild. A lot of the animals are functionally extinct in the wild. So this really drives our focus in conservation. The other key difference for us is an intentional focus on Victoria, our own backyard. And Jenny Gray was a real champion for this back in 2009, where she had the thought, what if zoos around the world all stopped focusing on pandas and orangutans and tigers and looked after your own backyard? And so lo and behold, it's a very good tactic that can really contribute to meaningful direct conservation outcomes. So Zoos Vic, putting our money where our mouth is in terms of Victorian really critically endangered species. And we have a whole bunch of tools and processes that we run species through to work out what's at high risk of extinction in the next 10, 20 years, and we prioritise them. Here they are. So these are what we call 27 fighting extinction species that if they didn't have conservation interventions, they would go extinct. So yeah, thankfully we have actually, for a lot of these species, prevented extinction. And for a few of them, we're starting to see their trajectories turn around. So not just preventing extinction, but actually contributing to healthier wild populations, which is incredible. And the spotted tree frog's an example of that, impacted by the bushfires. And now we're establishing new populations out in Paul's backyard, pretty much up in the mountains, alpine country, which is exciting. And I've also mentioned briefly the wildlife work that we do. So drawing on our vet expertise that has been honed through managing wildlife coming into the hospitals and zoo animals. Now so we've got 3 wildlife hospitals as well as zoo animal hospitals at 3 of the properties, hopefully 4 soon, if we get one at Kyabram. And the vets are doing an incredible job. And through state government funding, we've started training general practice vets around in the community to do wildlife emergency triage. So when they see wildlife, how to make quick decisions about euthanasia. A lot of this work is just quick euthanasia, not having to transport an animal for 4 hours to get to a Zoosvic hospital and then euthanize. So decision-making and support and creating a network of vets that help respond to wildlife. So it's a really exciting part of what we do. And like I said, it's really born out of a community response to the bushfires. Then community-focused conservation is really based on this concept of nature connection. So the theory behind it is you come through, the more connected to nature you are, the more positive experience you have through connecting to nature, the more likely you are to engage in pro-conservation behaviours. And so we track this regularly in our Victorian community. About 4 times a year, we test sentiment towards our work and level of support for different animal welfare and conservation or sustainability initiatives, and understand how we're going. And then we make changes in how we communicate and talk about this work if we're not happy where it's at. And then I've already mentioned a lot of the work that the social science team do in partnership as well with the university and other work, really putting this detailed science into practice. So this is an example of what the koala encounters look like now, and how we can focus on that more positive experience as a result of changing from that science. And it's really fundamentally based on how we need to evolve the whole zoo model. Our colonial mentality of where the origins of zoos came from, which is a very colonial organisation or its structure, from humans separate to nature and dominating nature, to humans as part of nature and a much more eco-friendly relationship. And this needs to filter into how we design zoo spaces, how we communicate about the work we do, how we share images of people and the work that we do. And so it's an ongoing process that's going to take a lot of change, but we have no doubt that's going to result in a much healthier relationship of humans with wildlife. And then I won't go over all of these, but I think being able to look back and reflect and say, we have made a lot of these changes in response to the science that we've explored, and as well community concern, the social science and the animal welfare science. Some of my favourites in there, and I should say as well, since about 2015, a lot of these changes have been a result of partnership with the AWSC and the support we get in being able to do this science in a really robust way. So yeah, the ethical wildlife experiences I've already talked about, partnerships with the RSPCA and World Animal Protection and other organisations as well, and the move to the elephants to Werribee, which is, as we've already talked about. And just really briefly looking at where to from here, noting that critical reflection needs to be integrated into change across zoos. Here's a snapshot of what I think, this is a Sally Sherwen opinion, of where I think future zoos should go, and what it's going to look like a lot more of. So really fewer animals, refined species choices, habitat focused experiences, not animal focused. So you don't have the expectation of need to go see this, the box, but actually you're immersed in nature and you have you see animals, you experience animals, but it's yeah, it's part of a collective habitat experience. Conservation-centric decision-making, a lot more data, to address all those knowledge gaps we talked about. And then the other two big areas I think need a lot of effort, and zoos have a key role to play that's really just starting out, is this area of conservation ethics. So we restructured our animal welfare team and conservation science team a couple of years ago, and we created a role called General Manager of Animal Welfare and Conservation Ethics to really drive this stuff. And George is here today. And and we're seeing, zoos play a really important role in this, having access to animal welfare scientists alongside conservation scientists, bringing those disciplines together and driving improved welfare outcomes for not only field work, but also asking questions around when should we intervene? And is it, when do we let nature take its course? Or when do we actually think we've got a duty of care or responsibility to act in the interests of animal welfare, which again, riddled with controversy, and everyone's got a different opinion on that. But just trying to shape some really sound processes and thinking and ethical frameworks there. Quick note here, something that surprised me when moving from an animal welfare mindset space to working in conservation, very little animal welfare knowledge or training or teaching in conservationists and field biologists. So I think a huge gap that needs to be addressed because it's just not a lens of which it's really approached. The biggest when you ask a lot of the conservation teams that are incredibly passionate and care deeply about the animals, you ask them, what are your animal welfare processes? It's always, the Animal Ethics Committee or the AEC approval process is how we manage welfare, which is a great start. But I know this room knows we can do a lot more than that. And so this is a really exciting area, again, I think, for zoos to play a role in. I'm going to skip that one because we could talk about that one for an hour. But lastly, I just wanted to say the other thing, and I've touched on a little bit as well earlier, what we do really need to grapple with the zoos is the colonial history and a lot of the things that have happened in the past, and how I think decolonizing a lot of our systems, processes and approaches to how we interact with, manage and do conservation work, it does need to be really unlearned and then rebuilt in partnership with First Nations people. And that is going to be, I think, a game changer for the ability to deliver incredible outcomes. So it's something we're working on. So ZoosVic, we've got a commitment to no Victorian terrestrial vertebrate species will go extinct. That drives our conservation priorities. And we've got an equal commitment that we will always work in partnership in supporting assertions for country, First Peoples assertions for country, which is amazing. That's it from me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sal. We set you a fairly big task to start us off with, but thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation that I think really quite nicely summed up some of the complexities of animal welfare, animal ethics and conservation within that zoo setting, and really allowed us to consider some of that impactful research that's perhaps driving that evidence-based change. And it looks like we're going to see some really significant changes when it comes to animal welfare for both our captive but also our wild species too. So I'll get everybody to perhaps think a little bit about what you would like to know from Sal, and there will be an opportunity to have some questions when we bring each of our three speakers together at the end. So I forgot housekeeping when I started. So perhaps reflect a little bit on that presentation and come up with some questions that you may have. Now we've got a little bit of something for everyone this morning, and we're going to pivot now and think about canine welfare science. So I would like to invite Dr. Mia Cobb, who is the Chaser Innovation Research Fellow here at the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne. And she is going to consider moving from basic lives or basic care to better lives when it comes to canine welfare.
Thanks, everyone. Great to have so many friendly faces in the room. And to have, I think we've ended up with close to 300 people registered for this event. A lot of them tuning in online and from around the world. So just really grateful to have you all here, and a warm welcome. I've just landed back from America in the last, I don't know, 70 hours or something like that. So I'm going to do my best not to sound jet lagged. Thank you. So obviously I'm based here at the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne, on country belonging to the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and just want to add my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. Today my talk in 15 minutes is going to whip us through 25 years of canine welfare science and project into the next 25 years. So buckle up, because we're going to be going fast. I'm going to highlight some key contributions to the field, including my own small contribution in research, and look at how our theory has translated to practice. Looking at what the next 25 years ahead might look like for our wonderful dogs, our canine welfare science, and also the practice of evidence-based change to the way we live with our dogs. I just want to thank the Chaser Initiative, who are the philanthropic funders of my current research fellowship for a 2-year period. It's given me a really special opportunity that's very rare in this space to focus on what dogs need to live their best lives with us. So thank you to the Chaser Initiative. Okay, so it's important to understand we're all on the same page about what animal welfare is when we're talking about it. It is both an academic discipline, but also a property of sentient animals. Sometimes, one thing I noticed when I was in the US recently is that it can often be aligned with things like human welfare programs. So people tend to think when you talk about animal welfare more about sheltering or support for displaced animals. But what we're talking about here is very much something similar to quality of life. We're talking about how an animal experiences their life. And obviously, a lot of what I'm saying is going to echo Sally's excellent presentation, but in a canine context, I almost laughed at how similar the things we're covering are. But yeah, the importance of one of the things that have, I guess, really come to life over the last 25 years is understanding that animals like dogs are sentient, and that means that they are able to experience different emotional states that are important to them. And this is not just negative states like pain and discomfort, but also positive states like joy, attachment, social bonding, those kind of things. And these mental experiences can vary on a continuum from very positive to very negative, and they can change over time. So we're not expecting some kind of utopic utopia where everyone's living just only good experiences. We know our own lives, that's not, reasonable. I stubbed my toe this morning. That really hurt. That dropped my welfare for a moment, but I've rebounded now. So considering on balance, how we're feeling at any given time is how we're thinking about an animal's welfare. And understanding that it's that mental experience that is what, ultimately really matters to them. So over the last 25 years, I'll just whip you through a whole lot of big thinking from people way more important than me. We've moved from, looking at things like the 5 freedoms, which was used a lot with different industry contexts and also in legislation, where we were looking at sort of freedom from negative welfare states, through to the 5 domains that acknowledges the importance of positive welfare states and things like agency as well. Some of these emerging topics that are gaining greater momentum within animal welfare science. If you're not familiar with the 5 domains, this is, as Sal mentioned, something that's getting a lot of uptake both in legislation around the world as well as industries and their own benchmarks. It looks at positive and negative experiences across 4 physical and functional domains, which is nutrition, the environment, physical health, and then behavioural interactions. And those interactions are with other animals, with people, and with the environment, and how all those positive and negative experiences feed in to the 5th domain, which is the mental experience of the animal. And from that, and looking at indicators of the experience, we can infer the welfare of the animal. We can't get in their heads and just say, how's your welfare today? The way that I can ask you and understand, well, you stubbed your toe, that sucks, sorry, that probably hurt. We need to look at indicators, and that's where we rely on our behaviour and our physiology, things like choice paradigms that we might do in our experiments, and different ways of getting insight into the animal's lived experience. So we know that animals are sentient. Because we understand that, that brings with it, and here we go again, bringing in the ethics to our animal welfare science, something we can't avoid in the way that we care for animals. Brings with it a moral obligation. Now that we understand these things are important to animals and they're able to experience them, when we're directly responsible for their care, we now have a moral obligation to provide good welfare or a good life or a life worth living. These are all terms that you probably have heard. And with that also comes these changing attitudes in our communities around us. And for dogs, that's mean we've reevaluated some of the ways that we have perhaps traditionally used them, relied on them, trained them, been entertained by them, and it's causing change. I think the greyhound racing industry is a great example of this, where when we look now at the key reason we race greyhounds, it's to enable gambling. Societally, that's not as palatable. And when we look then further at practices and things like that, when we have media exposés, we've seen big backlash from the community in terms of those practices not necessarily aligning with current community values. And as a result of that, we've seen greyhound racing phase out around the world. Most recently in New Zealand made the decision to ban it, and also Wales within the UK. And that's a trend that's been slowly unfolding over the 25 years. And I think greyhound racing is a really good canary in the coal mine, for want of a better word, I guess, for other industries that rely on dogs and are using them, because it really speaks to the need to be proactive in assuring the welfare of the dogs that we rely on and transparent to our public about how we care for them. So one of the studies that I did as part of my PhD was thinking, well, not everyone thinks about dogs the way that I do. And so maybe we need to do a bit of a benchmark and understand how people do think about the welfare of dogs. And if I were to give to you here, we've got a guide dog, an explosive detection dog, a free-ranging street dog somewhere in Europe, the average pet dog, a racing greyhound, and a drug detection dog, and ask you to line them up from the best welfare to the worst welfare. Even if you don't have a lot of inside knowledge, you've probably got a bit of a hunch on where you would line them up. And so I asked a few thousand people to do this, and this is pretty much what we saw. So dogs that were living very closely aligned and in working roles that had social value were tended to have the perceived highest welfare. So remember, this is not their actual welfare. This is what people think their welfare is. And it went through from guide dogs. The drug detection dog was just ahead of the explosive detection dog, probably because it doesn't have such a great chance of getting blown up. The average pet dog, racing greyhound, and then interestingly to me, the free-ranging street dog that, okay, may not have great nutrition or healthcare, but has a lot of social, environmental and sexual freedom, opportunity to exercise agency, was perceived as having the lowest welfare. And in some regards, these high-end working dogs have the least amount of agency and control in their lives, whilst they have excellent health and nutrition. So really interesting to think about how people are conceptualising what's important to dogs. And this is a survey we're going to repeat this year and see what's changed over the time since we conducted that experiment. There was one other category of dog that I asked about. Oh, I asked about 17 different categories, but I'll talk about here. There was one category that was even higher perceived welfare than guide dogs. Does anyone want to take a guess at what it was? I'll give 3 guesses. Not hunting dogs. Sorry. Not a sheepdog. Guard dogs? No, it was everyone's own dog. Had absolutely the best perceived welfare. And this is really interesting because, yes, maybe I just had a few thousand of the very best dog owners in the world that answered my survey. But what's more probable is that we're seeing a positive illusory bias, or something that we call the better than average effect. And this happens when we self-rate ourselves as drivers and also as parents. But this was the first time it was captured in relation to how we care for animals. And I think it's really important, particularly in Australia, we really love our dogs, but that doesn't mean that we're giving them a good quality of life. And that can be really uncomfortable to sit and think about, but I think it's really important that we do and we don't gloss over it, that we love them and so they've got great lives. We love them and we've got a lot to learn about how we can give them great lives. Okay, so looking at what's happened in how we assess welfare over the last 25 years, we've looked a lot at, I guess, these behavioural indicators of positive welfare. I think my favourite thing that's come out in the last 25 years has been directionality of tail wags in dogs and how that relates to their affective state. So know when their tail's going to the right, things are pretty good, they're feeling really confident. And if it's wagging more to the left, they're feeling a little bit anxious, unsure, generally asking for space away from something. And this is an indicator they use in their own interactions with each other, and we've just been a bit slow to notice. We've looked at cortisol a lot in dogs, and what we've learnt, and my own study doing a big meta-analysis where we pulled together the equivalent of 5 litres of dog spit from 30 different studies, has shown us that on its own it's not a great indicator of welfare. We really need to use behaviour and physiology. I've got someone giving me a double thumbs up. Thank you. It's nice to get audience support. We need to use multiple indicators of welfare, so not just behaviour and not just physiology, but ideally multiple physiological measures and behaviour, as well as really considered experimental designs so that we can actually understand what this means for dogs. One of the exciting other things that's popped out over the last few years is this increasing evidence about cognitive bias, so whether dogs are positive, optimistic. So if they've had good things in life, they tend to assume more good things are going to come. So they're optimistic or pessimistic if they've had negative things in life. And so we're getting better at asking that question of different animal species. And it's been really interesting seeing how this has been integrated into different research paradigms. And that's what's the glass half full, glass half empty. And of course, in dog space, we do use a lot of urine collection within our research. So it seemed appropriate. One of the things I've been really passionate about looking into is the impact of environment. So I started my PhD part-time when I was working full-time as the training kennels and vet clinic manager at Guide Dogs Victoria. We noticed that our young puppy raising dogs were coming into the training kennel and getting stressed and not coping so well with that transition of social and physical environment. And we wanted to look at introducing an enrichment program and seeing whether that could help them through that transition period, adjusting to life in the kennels a bit better. And so I've done a lot of looking at what people think is important to dogs living in kennels, as well as reviewing the evidence of what dogs tell us is important to them living in kennels. And one of the key things that's come out is looking at people in different industry sectors. So we're looking at people working with guide dogs compared to, say, border force dogs or racing greyhounds. There's quite different normative cultural beliefs within those sectors about what is okay or what is normal. And also that can be quite different between people working directly with the dogs as primary carers and the upper management. And this can cause all kinds of mismatches. And I think is really important to have a understanding of that, because a lot of what we need to do in improving dogs' lives is actually changing people. And speaking to Sal's, importance of the social science side of it, the interdisciplinary work that I do is very much not just about understanding canine behaviour and physiology, but also people's attitudes and the social psychology and behaviour change elements of how we can affect change that improves the lives for dogs by getting people to do different things. The other thing that came out through this research was noticing that we tend to immediately prioritise basic care elements, hygiene, safety, over perhaps thinking of the more social interaction and how do we provide positive experiences within kennels. So making sure that we're constantly advancing how we think about these problems and ask the questions and create new designs rather than just building another standard kennel block is going to be really important as we look forwards. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to do some quick spotlights on how we're applying the research that's been coming out in this space. And obviously with 25 years, there's so much. I hope I don't offend anyone by not mentioning their study. I think this is a great study that's looked at separation anxiety. Over the last 25 years, we've come a lot to understand about what was something, I guess, once considered a problem behaviour. We now understand it has a much more emotional basis. And the study I reference here is a really great one that's brought in that cognitive bias and showed that when dogs are given pharmacological support as well as a behaviour modification plan, they are, I guess, emotionally feeling more optimistic about how they're going in life. And that's a really neat study that's come from Danny Mills over at Lincoln in the UK. We've also seen some great study from Lisa Gunter and Clive Wynne over in the US. I love this one that's looked at shelter sleepovers. So where they have dogs in long stays in shelters, they have taken them out for a sleepover for a weekend and found that these dogs just do a lot of deep, long sleep, helps reset their stress system physiologically, lets them cope better when they return to a shelter. And just a really nice illustration of something we can actually put into action that can improve the lives of these dogs. Okay, briefly looking at some milestones, I was trying to think locally, what legislative things have we got that we can really pin our hat on? Obviously, the recognition of animal sentience is up there. Some bans on harmful practices. So tail docking is a great one that happened, originated in Victoria with Pauline Bennett's research there. Increasingly, we're seeing the banning of shock collars. We're getting increased regulation targeting how we sell dogs and puppy farms, but I think, you know, we weren't expecting the emergence of Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace perhaps 25 years ago. So we're always moving to keep up in a dynamic space. And excitingly, things like big data, the increase of international collaboration on studies, and the emerging technologies that have enabled us to do things like online surveys that 25 years ago we just couldn't do in the same way that we can now. We've also, personally, I've been involved, I guess, in some industry transformation projects. So things like the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, which we're really looking forward to seeing renewed soon. We did a benchmarking project back in 2009 with Paul McGreevy and Nick Branson, really taking stock of what is the welfare, how are our working dogs around Australia living. I also was fortunate to chair the committee that put together this Australian standard for privately contracted security and detection dogs. And that outlines a standard that has put market forces in place now so that when people are making decisions about which contractors they want to use, they can use ones that meet with the standard. And then more recently, I chair the Dog Welfare and Ethics Advisory Committee at Guide Dogs Victoria, and I sit on the International Advisory Panel for International Guide Dog Federation and Assistance Dogs International. And I'm really passionate about these kind of roles having impact, that it's not just tokenistic welfare washing, that it is, you know, leading to really meaningful change and development within these industry groups. Okay. I'm getting looked at because I think I'm hit time, but I'll just really quickly acknowledge we still have a lot of work to do ahead. So we do have some persistent, almost wicked problems that even though things like brachycephalic, flat-faced dogs or dogs with extreme conformation, we now really understand physically, health-wise, welfare-wise, the experience of the dogs, and we know it's not good for them. We're putting them into body shapes they really can't live a good life in. We're finding it really hard to change those situations. And this is where we need to work at how can we change the decisions that are being made by breeders, by show ring judges, by kennel clubs that are setting breed standards to help dogs live better lives. Commercial breeding oversight remains very inconsistent and problematic. Our global standards, like the zoo sector, vary dramatically. And it's important to recognise that 80% of the world's dogs aren't actually living with people. They are living free-ranging lives. So there's a lot of dogs out there that we're still to learn about. And some working dog sectors are resistant to evidence-based change. And that's not necessarily maliciously based. It can be because they just aren't getting the opportunities for education and that transfer of information. So really important that as scientists, we're communicating our findings broadly. And specialised behaviour support is inaccessible to many companion animal owners who may not be able to afford specialised support and care. Promise I'm nearly done. All right, next 25 years, I reckon there's going to be a lot more technology. We're already seeing the emergence of wearables, implantables, all these kind of activity trackers. So I think there'll be way more artificially intelligent powered behaviour analysis. We're seeing the emergence of digital enrichment and smart environment innovation. So dogs being able to exercise more agency than just a doggy door gives them in being able to control the environments that they're living in. And hopefully ethical frameworks for technology use with dogs, because whilst there's a lot of opportunity in this space, there's also the risk that dogs just become de-identified data points and we don't recognise them as sentient individuals. Individualised care. I'm just going to really quickly skip over this because Lauren is going to push me. I think we also will see a change in our social norms and expectations about how we care for dogs. We have to acknowledge there's going to be climate change adaptations. Owning dogs is probably going to become more expensive. Some great work from Erin Jones over in New Zealand, looking at this idea of canine consent and how it can be conceptualised and implemented into the way we live with dogs. Increase in focus on agency and positive welfare. And I think also the economics of dogs is something I'm really interested in right now. Understanding how we can value welfare and cost it accurately so that we can help prioritise it. And I think within professionalised areas, we're going to see more welfare assurance. So greater standards and policies, educational integration and professional certification. All right, that means we're nearly there. I just really want to quickly say that to get to happy dogs in 2050, we're going to need increased interdisciplinary collaboration. So it's really important that we have ethicists and psychologists and welfare scientists and vets all working together in this space. Making sure our research gets out into practice, centering the dog experience and looking forward with optimism. My glass is still half full. Thank you.
you, Mia. And we can come back to where to now in our discussion time. So in the interest of time, I'd now like to invite Suzanne Truong, who is a PhD student at the Vienna University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna.
Thank you so much for the introduction, I think. I hope you're all still okay in your seats. I was getting a bit of back pain myself, so we're at the last stretch. Okay, so I'm really excited to be sharing a really brief glimpse into the work that I've been doing on positive human-animal interactions. And following today's theme, I will briefly reflect on how our understanding of human-animal interactions have changed over time, and then the brief progress, so exemplified by my PhD project, as well as some food for thought for the future. The examples that I will give will be focused on farmed animals, but a lot of these concepts and methodologies can be applied across a broad range of species and contexts as well. So how has human-animal interaction research changed over time? Since its inception in the 1970s, most of the research focused on benefits for humans, as well as welfare, as well as welfare and productivity. And actually a lot of the work on welfare and productivity was pioneered by researchers right here at the Animal Welfare Science Centre. So there's a lot of, a big legacy of work here. Shout out to Paul Hemsworth. And especially in the agricultural context, predominantly the focus has been on reducing stress and fear response to humans. And it's only in recent years that we've seen a significant shift to positive animal welfare. And so now we know that positive human-animal interactions can benefit animal welfare in many different ways. However, it's still unclear what makes an interaction actually qualify as positive. So to illustrate this point, I want to indulge in a little activity. I'm going to show you 3 pictures, and I want you to think about if this interaction is positive from the animal's perspective. So is this interaction positive for the pig? Sorry, it's a bit dark, I hope you can see. Is it positive for the dog? And is this positive for the cat? Yeah. So we can tell a lot from behavior alone, but as you can see, sometimes it can be a bit tricky to tell. And so we know that we get a lot of enjoyment from cuddling animals, but do they enjoy our company? And how do we really know an interaction is positive from the animal's perspective? To answer this big question, we use a multidisciplinary approach, starting with what we know best, ethology. And I put a pig here because that's the species that I worked with for my project. And we complemented animal behavior with a bunch of other measures to try to get a fuller picture of what's going on. So we also had neuroendocrinology, so to understand what's going on in the brain. Bioacoustics, because we know pigs are very expressive with their vocalizations and it's been linked with emotional states. Pharmacology, because pharmacological manipulation can help to understand neurotransmitter systems. So again, a little bit more about the brain. Precision livestock farming to help us extract some fine-tuned behaviors that are usually quite hard to do manually. And finally, a bit of ethics to help us with reflecting and informing future direction. So what were some of the questions that we were asking in this project? The very first one was, do pigs prefer structured interactions or unstructured interactions? And the reason is because in scientific studies, usually we use a standardized protocol to try to have more experimental control, and we didn't know how the pigs would perceive this. So these 2 interactions were designed to be positive, gentle interactions, but we didn't know if the pigs had a preference for one over the other. I think you can tell which one's which, right? And so our findings were that there was no clear preference for structured versus unstructured interactions based on engagement and affective state. So this was things like the amount of contact the pigs made with the human, approach behavior, and tail wagging. However, the changes in the familiar human's behavior increased their attentiveness, and maybe there was a bit of frustration as well. And this could be due to expectancy violation or reduced agency. So the pigs were habituated to this unstructured interaction, and then at testing time, they were imposed with the standardized interaction. So We don't know, we couldn't disentangle in this study if it was because of this violation of expectation or if it's because they were no longer able to choose how they could interact with the human. But this finding highlights how design of interaction protocols can impact study outcomes, and it's important for us to take into account the pig's past experiences. Even if the interactions are designed to be positive, they could perceive it in a different way. Next, we asked, do pigs have a different neuroendocrine response in contrasting situations? So we focus on the neurotransmitters oxytocin, dopamine, opioids, and serotonin, because these are the main neurotransmitters in positive social interactions in humans and in rodents. And we wanted to do this 2x2 design. So from left to right, you can see a difference in familiarity. So there was a novel human and a familiar human. And then top down was the type of interaction. So on the top, you can see the humans are just ignoring the pig, and the bottom is the positive interaction. And what we found was that oxytocin was highest with the unfamiliar ignoring condition and lowest in the unfamiliar positive, and the familiar was kind of intermediate. And this was contrary to our predictions that oxytocin would be highest with the familiar human. But this is actually still in line with the literature that oxytocin increases when you're encountering an unfamiliar individual to facilitate this approach and bonding. And we also found that the dopamine metabolite HVA was higher 30 minutes post-test compared to pre-test. And so there was this change across time, but there was no difference according to the treatments. And we found that beta endorphins, which are the opioids, was higher 1 hour after interacting with the familiar human as opposed to the unfamiliar human, which was not what we expected, because we expected endorphins to increase after positive interactions compared to the ignoring condition. And so overall, these lack of differences according to the different treatments was perhaps because all of these interactions were perceived as positive by the pigs, so the differences were probably subtle. And this is actually a common challenge we have when measuring indicators of positive context. So in this same study, we also measured vocalizations. And we wanted to look again at this familiarity and type of interaction influence. And in particular, we wanted to look at the vocalizations produced during belly rubbing, because anecdotally, these sounded quite different to what they normally do. So I'm going to try and play it, and I hope you can hear it because it's a bit soft. I'll let it play. Yeah. So we did find that it's actually quite different to what's been previously published in the literature. So we had longer duration of grunts in the familiar positive condition when usually it's shorter with the familiar human. And also we're in the process of characterizing this new type of vocalization, because if you notice in that short bout, there was a mix of low and high frequencies as well as short and long durations, which is not how they're typically characterized in terms of negative and positive context. So if you use what's the typical categorization of vocalizations, you might get misleading results. So yeah, we're really excited about this. And finally, we asked, does pharmacological blockade of dopamine and opioid receptors influence pigs' wanting and liking of the interactions with a human? So the idea behind this is that dopamine D2 receptors and mu-opioid receptors are involved in the reward system. So if you block them, then it should reduce the wanting and liking of the interaction. And that informs us that the reward system is involved in these interactions. So we also use precision livestock farming techniques, so computer vision, and the thing that makes the pig look like a unicorn, that's our proxy for visual attention. And what we found was both receptor antagonists decreased pigs' latency to first contact with the human, which was our indicator of motivation or wanting. But contrary to our predictions, total time spent in contact, which was our measure of liking, was not influenced by either drug. But still, this altered pig behavior by these receptor antagonists suggests to us that the reward system might be involved. Okay, so from the evidence that I've provided, would you say that these interactions were positive? I think we still need to ask a couple more questions before we can get to the bottom of this. So for the last part of the talk, I want to pivot to some of the interdisciplinary work that I've been doing that can maybe help to shed some light on this question. I think we can't talk about the road ahead without talking about positive animal welfare. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been a significant shift towards this, but until now, we didn't have a consensus on what this definition, on what this term even means. And this is where the Costs Action Lift comes in, which is a European network of over 300 researchers that are working on concepts and methods of positive animal welfare. And just recently this year, they published their definition where 20 academics came together and developed a definition for positive animal welfare. So you can read it and judge for yourself if you agree with the definition they came up with. And within this network, I'm currently leading the sub-working group called Bridging Disciplines, where we're bringing interdisciplinary perspectives together to try to inform our understanding of positive animal welfare. And some key emerging themes that have come out of our interdisciplinary discussions are reflexivity, which involves critically examining our own biases, assumptions, and epistemic views, which are our beliefs about knowledge. Curiosity, so staying curious about animal lives and being open to other possibilities and not limiting to what we know from natural sciences. And interdisciplinarity, so engaging deeply with other disciplines to expand our boundaries of knowledge and incorporating other epistemologies, so other ways of knowing. And how can we incorporate or put into practice these three themes to help us with the road ahead? We'll start with reflexivity. So if we reflect on the epistemology of animal welfare science, we're all about empirical evidence, right? But we're currently at a dilemma. We're at the cusp of knowledge in terms of what we know about consciousness and sentience, and we don't have all the answers for this. And these are the key qualities that have been the major determinants of moral consideration for animals, as well as how we treat them. And so we're currently not equipped to deal with this question. And something that we're at risk of falling into is this something called empiricist trap, which is the over-reliance on empirical evidence and asking only questions that are easily measured. And the kinds of questions that we ask limits what we can find. And this quote comes to mind by Werner Heisenberg: "What we observe in nature is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." So the kinds of questions we ask are really important. Another assumption that animal welfare science hinges on, especially in the agricultural context, is the pastoralist view, or our notion of duty of care. And it comes from, or at least the way we know of our world as it is today, comes from a Western colonialist narrative, which influences how we see our interactions with other species. So these are just some of the assumptions and limitations that we've identified so far, but what can we do about it? So sentience is obviously still a really powerful criterion, and it definitely has its place in science and in legislation, but whilst we're still dealing with this dilemma where we can't find the evidence for different species, we can turn to other approaches. So we can look at other qualities like telos. So telos is like the final end or goal or the purpose of a being, and the idea is to allow a species to flourish in its own species way, because there are other things or other facets of animal lives that matter. That's not just about their ability to suffer. And this might remind you of the naturalness concept in animal welfare. In terms of the Western colonialist narrative, we can go through a process of decolonization of thought. So that's about recognizing the kind of narratives that we've naturalized over time and being open to other ways of life from other cultures. And this influences our relationships with animals as well. And to really get at the animal's perspective, we have to decenter the human and move away from this anthropocentric lens. And one of the ways to do this is to do multi-species ethnographies. And this is a study of interconnectedness between animal lives and human lives and all the ways that this can be shaped. And finally, I hope you can see that interdisciplinarity underpins all of this. And through interdisciplinary collaborations, we can adopt different methodologies and approaches to shape scientific inquiry and legislation. And this will help animal welfare science to deal with the unknowns to come. So with that, thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, while I invite our speakers to come up and have a seat up on our chairs, in the interest of some time, I'm going to actually ask of our audience, both in person and online, if we can move it, to just complete a couple of poll everywhere questions, because this information is really useful for us in planning our upcoming seminars as well. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment or two to answer those, and what we might do is publish the outcomes of these poll everywhere questions when we upload the video of today's session as well. So thank you all.
Going to the poll everywhere. Just
It's not really saving us much time, I'm sorry. All right. Well, maybe I'll jump off into our questions. So clearly we would love to be able to spend a little bit more time thinking about where to now, and I think each of you touched on it. But if I was to give you one chance to do one key thing, what would that be? Maybe with you, Suzanne, first.
I was told I have to speak really close to like this microphone. I think I would reiterate my point about interdisciplinary work, because we have a really particular lens when we do animal welfare science or any natural science work, and we can bring so much more knowledge and ways of thinking, and it really expands the mind when you're doing this kind of work. And so I think more interdisciplinary discussions and incorporating different methodologies.
If someone would like to fund me for 10 years, I think the work that is really needed, dogs we almost kind of forgot to look at. So I think it's important to mention that canine science itself is a very young field. It's almost like because they were asleep on our couches, we forgot to study them. And I know that traditionally they were considered an artificial species, and so they weren't considered worthy of studying. So we're a long way behind in a lot of respects. So there's a lot of basics that we need to do. And I think validating indicators of positive welfare in dogs is something that I would really like to focus on in the coming years.
I think Suzanne's last slide nailed it. All of those things up there. But yeah, in particular, challenging our own, our paradigms and our mindsets that we approach, and embracing curiosity to be, to challenge, I think, the long held assumptions that the industry, often all industries, zoos in particular, have. So a bit of a myth buster mentality, which is helpful.
I'd now like to open it up to the floor, both here in person and online. Maybe we'll start with someone in person. Does anyone have a person question? Yeah. Run. Got a microphone runner.
Thank you to the panel, Sal, Mia, Suzanne, absolutely amazing, and Lauren at the centre, to still see amazing work going on, and hearing your thoughts about the past 25 years and what you see in your different industries as well, where the 25 years is going to hopefully head for your industries. Now, I think my question might be quite a difficult one, but just will love views and what your thoughts for all three of you. Seeing that zoos, for example, are leaning towards not going for close interactions with humans anymore, and the importance for that for animal welfare in a zoo setting, dogs great close interactions for positive welfare, similar with pigs. How do you guys see that actually playing with the attitudes of the community? And could that be barriers for improvements in animal welfare in your respective industries?
Great question, Sam. It's really difficult because it means that humans, which we're not so good at, we need to really clearly differentiate, I think, between different categories of animals and how they live and should live and what's good for them in different contexts. So how we treat a zoo animal should be different to how we treat our pet, which should be different to other human animal interactions. So I think having that conversation with the community and being clear about why we do certain things with animals would be a good start.
I'll answer this in relation to working dogs because I think it's really salient in that space. I think over the next 20 years, we're really going to need that evidence of good welfare assurance for the community to trust that these dogs are being looked after in a way that merits their continued use. And let's face it, usually we use working dogs to do things that either it's cheaper for them to do, so let's say herding livestock, or they're doing things that we just can't do, like scenting currency or drugs or bombs. Okay, we're just not equipped to do that in the way that they do. So I think that welfare assurance piece is going to be really important. But when we consider the training methods and the dogs that we're breeding and selecting, I think there's also some really big decisions that need to be made in regard to that. Are we selecting the right temperament and behavioural profile for the work that we need? And if selecting that profile means we can only train them using punitive methods, then there's a lot of self-reflection and big decisions that need to happen in that space. And I think we're going to see changes around that kind of area, because I don't think the public will consider it appropriate to be, hanging dogs up on prong collars and using shock to train them, when we know that there are ways to train dogs effectively using positive reinforcement and in ways that enhances our relationship with dogs rather than being detrimental to it.
Okay, it's a tough question, especially because animal welfare science is a socially mandated science, right? And also with positive animal welfare, a lot of this is driven by changes in public perception. And I think the more people are knowledgeable about welfare issues, the more they will demand change. In terms of, it's hard to say because what we care most about is the impact ultimately on the animal. So a lot of the centres work on behaviour change with the stock people who work directly with the animals is really good. But there's also so much in the political space, right? As you know, because you work in and also with funding and the types of work that we can do. So I think definitely public perception is changing and it's going to put pressure on the kinds of work that we have to do, but there's so many influencing factors like industry bodies and so many people involved that it's hard to say who ultimately will impact it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
And also perhaps that ability to demonstrate those positive experiences as well. So not just say that they're occurring. Yep. Peter, do we have anyone online with a question?
We have a couple. One refers to fur babies. And Lena says, it seems, at least in the US, that the creation of fur babies and pet parents is not so different from older zoo animal-human interactions, such as a picture with a tiger. So the human understanding of their pet dog welfare is tilted more towards the human needs and not the dog needs. I think you captured that, Maya, but any comments on there?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge, and I didn't get to it in my talk, was the fact that I guess a lot of our research in this space has been heavily influenced by the funding, and the funding has tended to prioritise how companion animals help us, what are the benefits that people get from them, rather than what do they need to live a good life with us. And so I think, that has skewed perhaps some of the information that's been coming out to the public as well, which may also then relate to those beliefs and attitudes that underpin our behaviours towards those animals. So if we can unlock the funding that supports research to be focused on how it helps people, then, you know, hopefully we can uncover some better information, more balanced communications that can help people recenter dogs where they should be in that relationship and realize they're not just there for our benefit, that they are sentient individuals that deserve their own consideration.
Thanks, Mia. And that theme seems touched on in the different fields today as well. Can I ask one more?
Yep, absolutely.
Because I also want to know the answer. Mia, what about communication buttons?
Oh, thanks, Peter. So I've actually met with and had a great chat with Alexis Devine, who lives with Bunny the button dog, who's TikTok famous. I think, you know, it's a really interesting space. It's really exciting that people want to understand their dogs better. And I think, you know, buttons are a way they're exploring that. I'm yet to see really independent, well-conducted experiments or studies that show us that dogs are using them to communicate in the way perhaps we want them to be. I would also say, you know, I could fund my research for every time someone said, if only my dog could talk to me. If I had $1 for every time someone said that to me, I'd be great. But, you know, our dogs are talking to us all the time. We just need to get better at reading their behavior. And if anyone's keen on how they can improve their skills, I'd highly recommend, there's a really cute little book called Doggy Language by Lily Chin. It's a graphic book, just like a little tabletop book, but really, really informative and a great way to upskill on understanding dog behavior.
Excellent, thank you. Any more questions from in person? Maybe one up the back and then one.
Yeah, thanks. This one, yeah. Great, thanks everyone. Fantastic information this morning. My question is specifically for Sal, but others may have also thoughts on it as well. You mentioned at one point talking about this knowledge gap that you're finding with working with conservationists and working in that space and bringing that animal welfare science lens to it, and how even it was only in 2015 that the first animal welfare scientist was employed by the zoo, and kind of bringing that whole side of things into conservation, seeing a very similar sort of a big parallel with the sort of work we're doing in animals in research. And so I was curious as to whether over your time you've come across any particularly useful strategies or not useful strategies for trying to introduce that animal welfare lens to a group of scientists who haven't had that sort of lens before, and getting the importance of that across.
Yeah, good question. Big question. I don't have the answers. I think it's, I mean, I just know it needs to happen. I see the huge value when it does happen. But in terms of how to do it, I think it's a process we're still going through. I mean, a great start for us at Zoos Vic is having the animal welfare scientists in the same physical team as the threatened species biologist and ecologist, and really, you know, sitting in the same space, having those conversations, but also setting up meetings to purposely drive the interdisciplinary conversations and chats. Also setting up forums where we do talk about welfare-based conversations and interventions with the threatened species work, to go, how can we improve that methodology, or is, you know, the benefit greater than the harms of that, or, you know, just thinking about that. But it's the whole field is really riddled with a lot of these trade-offs that need to happen. And you know, and it doesn't mean, I think there's a lot of baggage that potentially the conservationists world can see from the animal welfare that's potentially been mixed up with animal rights issues that needs to be, you know, shaken off, and the benefits of bringing good animal welfare science to the table, not in a, you know, necessarily an animal rights frame. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of baggage to shake, and a lot of progress that can help. But I think my advice would be, start with a pretty simple, straightforward project where conservationist animal welfare scientists have shared goal and outcome. That's going to be easy to do. You can see improvements pretty quickly that benefit conservation and animal welfare, and start there and then grow.
Excellent. Positive though too, I think, when we think about it, that role really has only been there for about 10 years. It feels longer, and the fact that it's perhaps driven others within industry as well to put those people in those types of positions to really make it part of normal practice. So we have one more down here. Oh.
Yes, chat with Suzanne. Based on your work at Vienna, do you think that any human interaction, as long as it's not aggressive, with a pig is positive? Just being there is positive.
I have to think about this because my intuition is to say no, it's not automatically positive. And as I kind of alluded in the last slide, we still need to do a lot of work to really get at the animal's perspective and what matters to them. Because just because if we can read their signals and measure these things that we think are indicators of positive, are positive indicators, it doesn't mean that it is for them, because they have also individual differences and individual preferences as well. So just by the human being there, I would say it's more like a habituation. They get used to the human, they reduce fear. That's good. It's not stressful for them, but for it to be really positive, I think it really matters to what the animal wants. And I think, we have to get more at that.
Yeah. A question, particularly to Mia, but maybe the three panelists. Sorry. My question relates to the welfare of dogs in households. And it seems to me that the problems are under-recognised. And I think some of Carmen Glanville's PhD indicated that there was a tremendous variation amongst people surveyed in terms of their concept of welfare. And I think that whole area of dogs in households is probably under-recognised as a problem.
Yeah, I think it's not just dogs in households. I think it's dogs on private property. So I think you could say the same of breeding establishments. You could say the same of households. You could say the same of any kennel facility that's not being publicly audited or fully transparent in what they do. It's very hard to enforce even the best regulation if you're relying on whistleblowers from inside an area, or for people that are, I guess, caught up in their tunnel of culture and belief to recognise that maybe the way they're caring for their dog isn't the best way. And I think we're really lucky over the last 20 years that we've seen the increase of things like small cameras that we can put into households, online surveys so we can ask people how they care for their animals. That is giving us, sometimes bias, but increased understanding of what people think is important. And I think, the next step is to then go and look at, well, how can we better translate what we're understanding through other areas of canine science into how do we give dogs a great life with us, and how can that be reflected in legislation? I mean, Paul, that the lag between what we understand on the frontier of evidence and getting that into policy can be decades long. So it's not often a revolution, it's often more of an evolution. And often what is legislated is the lower end of what we think is good. So I think, it's on all of us to keep tooting that horn and hopefully sharing our science in a way that helps people at home do the best thing by their animals.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Can I have everyone please join me in thanking our speakers? I think a really thought-provoking session that's allowed us to consider 25 years of animal welfare science research, to think about pathways forward. We clearly have some work to do, but hopefully it's left everyone feeling quite inspired towards going in and tackling that work. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us both in person and online. We really do value your input and the opportunity for discussion. I'd like to invite those that are in person to stay and share with us some light refreshments and perhaps have an opportunity to continue some of these discussions. And I will just alert you to inviting you to come and join us again for our second seminar this year, which will be in early June. And we are going to tackle the topic of environmental enrichment. So hopefully you can all join us then. So thank you very much.